So we'll talk about tectonics in more detail later after we go through the earth-forming materials and the internal processes of the earth. But I wanted to do a basic discussion of the development of the idea around plate tectonics and how it came out of discussions about continental drift. To provide that framework for us to have in place as we're thinking about different earth materials and processes. But also, I think this is a good case study of how science works. And so we're going to do a little bit of a dive into history here. So, maybe a bigger dive into history, but we're not going to spend a lot of time back here. Just the idea about continental drift, the idea that the continents as we see them today, or as people saw them in Europe 500 years ago, or wherever people were working, the idea that continents were not fixed does go back quite a ways, although it's never been, until recently, a widely held view. So this guy, Ortelius, he was a major map maker, and I have an affinity for maps, so I thought it would be nice to throw him up here. But he had kind of an offhand comment, because he spent so much time, working with these maps, that boy, it looked like the Americas were just kind of torn away from Europe and Africa. And I don't know how many of you have noticed that looking at maps. Okay. I must have been in maybe not kindergarten, because we moved into town, so it must have been first or second grade. Even in that, you look at the map and you say, boy, those look like they kind of fit together. So he threw out this idea about the Americas being torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods, but this obviously didn't go anywhere. Not in the 16th century. There would be no way to really collect evidence around this, to think about it. We really didn't have a geological perspective about the world at this point. And map making is just kind of a description of where things are without any kind of necessarily any kind of mechanistic processing underneath it at that time, certainly. The guy who's really mostly associated with this idea of continental drift is Alfred Wegener, a German who was trained as an astronomer. He did a lot of pioneering work in meteorology and climatology, as I've got listed there. He's the one who really began to build the case for continental drift. The idea that continents are not fixed in place, but they have the ability to move around the world. So we'll talk about some of the evidence he put together, which is also one of the questions I asked you on the quiz. I want to go into some of that in more detail. I want to ask you, though, what's wrong with this picture that I pulled off the internet? You don't know Alfred, so take my word for it that it's a good likeness of Alfred, but what's wrong with the picture?
Is it that the tectonic plates don't necessarily fit together, the continental shells that fit together?
It's the idea that there are plates on that diagram at all associated with Wegener, because he did not propose plate tectonics. He proposed continental drift. And so the reason why I asked that weird question, what's wrong with this picture, is to reinforce that in your mind that continental drift and plate tectonics are two separate ideas, two separate theories, hypotheses. They're clearly related. What we know about plate tectonics and how those plates function, what we know about that today explains continents and actually ocean crusts as well moving around. but that's not what Wegener proposed. All he proposed was, I have evidence that the continents as we see them today were not always in the place that they were. So, like I said, he assembled all this evidence, and we'll go through. Ultimately, he was rejected by the geological community of his time. His ideas were not accepted, except by a handful of practicing geologists, and we can talk about some of the reasons why. And unfortunately, he died early on an expedition to Greenland, so he never really had a chance to be vindicated. Let's see, he died at age 50. He would have had to live about another 20 more years, which wouldn't be unreasonable. And he would see the ideas come around full circle. So, I asked you on the quiz what evidence that Wegener put together. So, what did you come up with? Okay, so we got fossils that he pointed to. Anything else? Okay, so there's the fitting together of shapes.
The geological similarities between North America and Europe,
Okay.
like as far as Maine and Scotland go, or something like that.
Yeah, so we'll look at some of these in a little bit more detail, but these are essentially the kinds of things. I'm trying to remember, I think it might have actually been reading some reference about similar fossils in different places that triggered his ideas to begin with, but then, he did for continental drifts sort of what Darwin did for evolution by natural selection. Spent a lot of time just accumulating evidence in support of the idea. There's one big difference between why he was not successful and Darwin was, that we'll talk about when we get to the point where we talk about why his ideas weren't accepted. Okay, so first, he spent time documenting the kind of patterns that we've all talked about seeing. The fit of the continents actually works a little bit better if you do continental margins rather than coastlines. So that's what's plotted here. You can see that, for example, South America has continental margin under the ocean, but still part of the continent that extends out from the coastline, especially in like areas down in here, and things fit even better when you take those structures into account. So that's a clue. The fossil evidence is this kind of evidence. So, for example, we have different let's see, these would be probably late Paleozoic reptiles, and it would all have been late Paleozoic. For example, Sinonethus fossils are found in South America and in equatorial Africa. And for this Glossopteris, I think it's a fernish kind of plant. You see it in South America, you see it in southern Africa, you see it in southern India. You see it, fossils of it, in Antarctica and Australia. So already you should see something a little strange going on here, right? Does this look like the kind of thing that will grow in Antarctica? No. Okay. So here's a puzzle. here's data that the natural world throws up. And we'll talk about how Wegener dealt with it in a minute, but put yourself in the mindset of early 20th century geologists. How would you explain this pattern? So what I'm going to shut off the recording for a little bit, give you time to get into some groups of 2, 3, 4, whatever works out, and come up with what are the different explanations you might propose if you are trying to apply the lens, the perspective of an early 20th century geologist. Okay, so I think we've had about as much productive discussion as we're going to have in the groups. So, I mean, what potential ideas could you throw out? Land bridges. So, what does that mean? You threw it out, Grace, so you have to explain what it means.
Okay. There were just bits of land that we didn't know about in between the continents that animals could migrate across, and then I guess
Trump.
the sea level is rising and they don't see them anymore.
Okay.
And that's why.
So, yeah, if you postulate land bridges, then you have to say, well, where did they go, right? So, could sea level rise explain the fact that we had land bridges before and we don't have them now? With the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska, yes, because the ocean basin there is shallow enough that during periods of high glaciation, so much water is sucked out of the ocean level drops enough to expose a swath of land that animals and early humans, well, not even that early, like 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, could have migrated across. That scenario is more difficult, tying South America and Africa together by a land bridge, because how do you expect the depth of the Atlantic Ocean to compare to that? Okay. The ocean would have had to been really, really small for there to be exposed land all the way across. Assuming that the ocean basin is fixed and we're just moving the surface of the ocean up and down. How else might land bridges go away? Let's say that we don't really have any change in sea level major enough to have the land bridge. Well, wind erosion, yeah, okay. Maybe. Well, you'd also have to explain why a continent like this and a continent like this would have this little tiny stretch of land bridging them. But maybe there was that little strip and it got eroded away. Or what people more likely proposed is, a collapse of the ocean floor. Boom, like Gandalf on the bridge, you shall not pass, and land bridge collapses. So that's obviously a potential explanation, one that has a lot of problems. Even people back then saw that there were a lot of problems. Other potential ways of explaining the distribution.
Well, kind of like natural migration of the mesosaur could also explain the Velociraptors being on all of the continents, because the mesosaur was aquatic, so it would go from South America to Africa and bring
Spores with it?
And it's,
Poop?
Yeah.
Okay, we can say poop. Okay, so migration. Maybe these critters could swim. So if they could swim, what then do you have to explain about these distributions?
Part of the species went one way, the other way involved.
Yeah, or why did they swim to here and not swim to here?
Because of food resources.
Okay, so maybe there's a unique habitat here, there's a unique habitat here at 300 million years ago. And you had source populations here and some intrepid survivor. You got washed out on a storm and rafted on some, well, we didn't have coconut palms at that point, but somehow made it over, established in comparable areas.
That kind of makes sense though, because it's like the bottom of the Amazon and then the convoluted rainforest.
Okay. Tying this area and this area and this area and these areas and here together by some kind of targeted dispersal to particular kinds of habitats.
Lots of wind.
Lots of wind. Interesting little band of subtropical habitat here in Antarctica. Okay, so it's very convoluted. Right? However, if you allow the continents to move around and you fit them together, then imagine that it's all one continent at some point. And here is a range for these guys. And here's the range for these guys, etc. So, continental drift solves some problems. It gives us a simpler explanation in one respect, in that we don't have to postulate land bridges and then get rid of them somehow, or weird migration patterns. Did you guys have any other possibilities you brainstormed? Those are the two big ones. Okay. But it's perhaps not a simpler explanation, because then you have to explain how the continents can move around. Okay. People mentioned the geological evidence, and so when you actually fit these different places together on the basis of their shapes, and then look at the geological formations, you see specific formations that match up on either side of the rift. Again, strengthening the idea that these geological formations were laid down or intruded, depending on what kind of structure we're talking about, at a time when the continents were adjoined, and then when the continents split apart, obviously it split those down the middle. This down here is a little bit different idea. We would expect, if the continents are moving around and bumping into each other, that part of that bumping would lead to different kinds of mountain ranges or rising up of the landscape, which is what orogeny means. And so we see things like the Appalachian Mountains range, which we know is a very old and ancient mountain range because it's been worn down quite a bit. We could come up with an explanation for how it arose if we're thinking about, Africa ramming into the eastern side of what eventually becomes North America. This, I think, is an interesting example. First of all, let's look here. This is a figure from Central Park. If you look at a number of the outcrops in Central Park, you will see these basically scrape marks that go across in parallel lines across them. These are not fractures. These are not fracture planes in the rock. These are, the surface of the rock has been like someone came along with a nail and scraped it. These are done by glaciers. So as glaciers move across the landscape, they pick up rocks and other debris at the bottom of the glacier. You've got tons of ice forcing these rocks across the pre-existing bedrock. Basically, you're going to mar the surface. And so when you see these parallel striations in areas that's been subjected to glacial deposits, typically those are the result of this kind of scouring process. So, can't see it real well because of the toolbar down at the bottom here, but there are similar kinds of glacial deposits and striations going back to the Permo-Carboniferous boundary. Okay, so Permo is from Permian. And so we basically have evidence for glaciers in these areas mapped out in white, and glaciers moving in the directions of the arrows there. So, how do we explain that in a early 20th century geologist perspective? India is located where now?
More or less on the equator.
Yeah, do you associate India with glaciers much? No. Okay. Southern Africa, not so much either. Australia, I mean, can you imagine a glacier in the Australian outback?
Yeah, I see pictures of snow in Northern Australia, so maybe.
Yeah. So, if we're seeing evidence of glacial deposits occurring in these areas, it's either one of two things. Either, well, what would those two options be? I mean, what would it mean to have glaciers in India?
It was either really cold in India or India was in a different spot.
Right. So either we have the massive worldwide glaciation going from the poles to the equator, which we know has happened a few times in Earth's history, or India was somewhere else, more susceptible to glacial formation. We know at the same time that there were glaciers in India. There were, let me get this right because this is off the top of my head, there were like coal deposits being laid down in England, indicating that England at that time was basically a tropical, heavily vegetated, swampy kind of area. Okay? So that's not consistent with worldwide glaciation. Okay? So if India is glaciated not because there's a worldwide glaciation, the other option is, well, India was likely somewhere else at this time. When Wegener put the continents together again, basically all of those glacial areas that we now see scattered across the globe would have been a contiguous glaciated area. And where would this most likely have been? South Pole at the time. Now, Wegener didn't make much of this, but modern day ecologists really make use of this idea of continents moving around to explain the distribution of modern day species. So we've got rat-type birds. Rat-type birds are just simply, these are the primitively flightless birds. These groups have never had wings, well, never had flight. Okay? They don't have the same hollow bone structure. It's clear that these have been terrestrial lineages all the way. And yet we see ostriches in Africa, we see emus in Australia, and cassowaries and kiwi birds, and we see rheas in South America. So, these birds don't fly, they're not good swimmers. How do we explain them being, as a group, restricted to these southern continents?
They used to run so fast, they run out of water.
They run out of water. No, the idea is that this group as a whole would have originated when the southern continents were together in Gondwanaland. And then as the bits and pieces of Gondwanaland broke up into the different continents and moved around, they took their rat-type bird lineages with them, and then they differentiated into the different species once they were geographically separated. This is not part of Wegener's evidence, but it is an important principle for explaining patterns of biogeography that we see today. Okay, so we've got all these pieces of evidence. So why didn't all the geologists jump up and say, "Good job, that explains a lot. Let's get on board with this"?
You like the technology proof?
Okay, you lack the technology. We'll come back to that. I think that's an important point because, as we look at the development of area after area after area of science, the development of instruments and technologies that allow us to ask new questions and collect new data really are important for how those areas develop. There's a more fundamental issue, though. Yeah. So, for a good theory, you need to be able to not only explain patterns in nature, but you have to have a reasonable mechanism for carrying that out. And Wegener basically had, the Earth is spinning. And, maybe as the Earth spins, continents get thrown further away from the pole, so they move more toward the equator. So if Gondwanaland had all been on the South Pole, and they're spinning around, maybe the force of that is going to move the continents away. The other, he also talked a little bit about maybe the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. These tidal forces could perhaps push things around as well. The problem, though, is that he's proposing that we have the. Let's see if I can draw. He's basically thinking about the continents as a lighter landmass that is kind of floating on the basal crust, the oceanic crust. And what he actually had to propose, because of the geological frameworks of the time, is that these forces somehow push the continents through the crust like an icebreaker going through, ice jam up on the Arctic. So continents are going to be basically being forced through the crust, and so in order to do that, you're going to have massive forces. And you're going to have forces that are so intense that the continental masses themselves are going to be broken up. So there's a problem there. He doesn't have a good mechanism that will that will deal with this. I just want to, okay, so, no mechanism. Just want to make the point, though, that the geologists of the time didn't have really good alternative mechanisms either to explain what's going on. So, how could they account for Wegener's evidence? So we've talked about the issues with the land bridges, which were, a big proposal to solve some of that. Geologists at the time had no good way to explain the presence of mountain ranges like the Alps and the Rocky Mountains and Appalachia. Through volcanic processes, you can explain one mountain, but it's hard to explain a mountain range that's clearly not volcanic. And so, they were dancing around, theoretically dancing around, talking about land bridges, subsidence of different sections of the ocean, the idea that, maybe we think the Earth is cooling off, and we know that spheres, as they cool off, they contract, and so a contracting Earth might have its crust wrinkled as it's shrinking. Very similar to Lowell's ideas about mountains on Mars, Allie, what we talked about last time. As the planet shrink, basically the wrinkling of that crust as it shrinks is perhaps what's responsible for the mountain ranges. And maybe that's also responsible for there being land bridges at one point, and then later they disappeared because they're destroyed. But it's not really very satisfying either. Just from a sociological perspective, it didn't really help that Wegener was a meteorologist trying to tell geologists how the Earth worked. Okay. So, he did great work in climatology and meteorology, but didn't have the street cred among the geologists to get many of them to accept his ideas. Right.
Could there also be some political aspect to it, being German during the interwar period?
Well, he was, I don't think so. He was working in Austria, and, German science was very well respected. So, I don't think that's going to be an issue. And actually, he published his early volumes on this were even before World War I. And I'm not sure if he was even living in Germany at that time. But there could be nationality issues, not necessarily political ones, but just the fact that he's publishing in German and he's in Austria, and maybe the English geologists, the lineage following Maxwell and so forth, all the geology that's going on in England, not necessarily picking up in the scientific literature as much. We still have those kinds of issues today. It's less of an issue, but it could be part of it. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about plate structure and function and all of that more geological detail, because I want to look at this more as a historical kind of exercise. But I do want to mention that essentially in the 50s there was the institution of a lot of large-scale science after World War II. There's a lot of money being pumped into public funded research. There are a lot of large research projects going on. In particular, the International Geophysics year. The IGY, International Geophysical Year, was kind of the culmination of this, but all through the 50s there are these large-scale, big research projects. There's a lot of emphasis or interest in mapping the ocean in ways that it had never been mapped before. Why do you suppose there might have been a lot of interest in mapping the ocean following World War II?
Is it because submarines were a thing now?
Yeah, submarines were a thing. The ocean depths were of interest militarily, commercially, scientifically. We had new technologies. We had the ability to do sonar depth profiles and really get an idea of what was going on. We could drag magnetometers around because there was a lot of financial and resource support for these large science projects. So we're collecting a lot of data. We're using new instruments, as you mentioned, that we didn't have before, and getting a new picture of the world, specifically a new picture of the oceans. I just want to briefly highlight three things that we'll probably cycle back to more as we really talk in more depth about plate tectonics and how it actually really does all work. One thing was with the mapping of the ocean, the identification of these mid-ocean ridges, not only the mid-Atlantic ridge, but mid-ocean ridges. So as the oceanography boats were going out, doing all these mapping studies, data were coming back. Just came across recently an article about Marie Tharp in particular, one of the few-ish women geologists at the time. Obviously not allowed to go out on the boat because we just couldn't have women out on the research vessels at that time. But she did tremendous work in getting the data from all of these sonar profiles, and actually was pretty much responsible for this initial mapping of the ocean basins that identified these mid-oceanic ridges. And some of the men she was in the research collaborations with, looked at that initially and discounted them because, oh crap, that looks like continental drift. We can't be talking about that because we know continental drift doesn't work. Check your figures. What are you thinking about? But when it became clear that we did have these mid-oceanic ridges, that provided a very strong basis for plates and plate tectonics. And so, of course, her male colleague published the seminal paper, laying this all out. She was never cited on it, which was kind of typical at the time. But this is one of the key pieces of figuring out that there might actually be a mechanism that would allow the continents to move around. Related to this, they were taking samples of ocean crust at different locations, and now we had radiometric dating, so we could actually put dates onto the different areas of the crust. And so what we see, if we look just in the Atlantic, what we see is the crust that's associated with this mid-Atlantic ridge is relatively young. And then the crust gets older the further and further away you get from that ridge. So what is your how would you then interpret those results? New crust is being produced where? In the middle, at the ridge. And then over time, what happens to that crust? It gets pushed out. And so the further and further away you get from the ridge, you have older crust because it's the crust that was produced earlier and eventually got pushed further and further away. So, this kind of data basically sealed the deal for the idea that there are plates that are being produced, they're moving around. And then why then, for example, is South America moving? It's not because the continent is plowing its way through the crust. What's actually happening? The whole piece of crust itself is being pushed by all of these tectonic forces. That was just reinforced by this paleomagnetic data that I think we'll talk more about when we actually get to talking about the mechanics of plate tectonics in more depth. But all these new pieces of data coming out of these big science studies provided a mechanism that Wegener never had, which is he doesn't have to explain anymore how the continents can plow through the crust, because now we have an explanation, a mechanism for pieces of crust itself moving around. And I guess I just want to reinforce that in terms of scientific revolutions, this is one of the most massive and quickest ones. Basically, over the span of a couple of years in the middle of the 1950s, the whole perspective of geology changed. You know, you basically went from the pre-plate tectonic worldview of geology to the post. And I know I've heard stories of researchers at the time that would have papers in press that were still the switch came so quickly that researchers would have papers coming out one right after the other with representing this flip in the worldview. So this is not a gradual let the old geezers who believe in the old ways die off and be replaced by the young. So that's why I think this whole development of plate tectonics is an interesting case study in how science works. I tell you what, let's why don't you take 5 minutes on the back of your quiz, just reflect a little bit about what lessons you can pull out of how science works based on this historical development of the idea of plate tectonics, how it was, how it arose out of this idea of continental drift, why things were accepted at one point and they weren't earlier, I just want to read you reflections about this.